Hello and welcome to Titanic Legacy, a podcast that explores Titanic's lasting impact through conversations with creators, authors, artists, historians, filmmakers, musicians, entrepreneurs, and more who continue to keep the Ship of Dreams legacy not only alive, but thriving through their creative work. I'm your host, Paul Carganilla, and today I'm excited to bring you a conversation with someone who exemplifies the whole purpose of this show. A podcaster and soon to be published author whose creative work has kept Titanic's memory alive and built a beautiful online community around her. I've been blessed to have her appear as a guest on my other two podcasts, covepod and Magical Mystery Hour, and I'm thrilled that she's joining us here today on the Titanic Legacy podcast, as she is someone who definitely helped inspire this whole project. We're blessed today. I'm blessed to call her a personal friend, though we've yet to meet in person. Hopefully 2025 will change that. And ladies and gentlemen, LA Beadles.
Hi. That's the best intro I've gotten ever. I love it.
I've got more. Are you ready? Ladies and gentlemen, she is a historian with a PhD in American history from the University of Georgia.
There it is right there, by the way.
Hanging on the proof.
There you go.
Physical proof. She lives in North Carolina. I almost said Nashville, Tennessee. Asheville, North Carolina, with her wonderful husband and two children who enjoy exploring the world with her alongside her on her adventures. She's the creator of the pinnacle Titanic podcast, Unsinkable, which you can find on any podcast platform if you haven't heard it already. And she's on the podcast is on Instagram at Unsinkable Pod, and she's got a great, fantastic Patreon community going over on Patreon at patreon.com/unsinkablepod. Oh my goodness, you are, like I said, when I was toying around with the idea of starting this podcast, I actually came to you and picked your brain because, with the kind of explosion in the podcast world of Titanic material, it harkens back to the origin story of your pod and why you became a forerunner. Tell us how Unsinkable began.
It's a great question because I don't think I've ever told the story with any detail. I think I say jokingly a lot, Unsinkable started in my son's closet, which it did. But I think I sort of just rest on the anecdote and I don't tell the full thing. But basically like a lot of us in the early pandemic in 2020, we were at home more. I think we all felt compelled to chase maybe some long simmering ideas or dreams or projects that are inside us because we suddenly had more time and we were suddenly, confronted with this notion that the world could be quite scary and there were a lot of new unknowns. And so it was sort of a make it count moment. And for me, Titanic had always been there since I was 13 and the movie came out. And then I also got super into the ship's history when I was a teenager. And then over the course of many years, it just would sort of ebb and flow, lots of water metaphors. And early 2020, I just decided, okay, I'm at home, I'm reading constantly now. Let me order all of the new Titanic books. And really the one, and I can go back and I can look in the front page of my copy now, and there's so many notes, but I got Gareth Russell's book, Ship of Dreams, which I really, truly think is the best academic work that's been done on Titanic in book form in years and years. And at the time, that was still fairly new. And so I opened it up and just started making copious notes. And it's funny because I wrote the date that I read it. Yeah, you've got it. So anybody watching or listening hasn't read it yet, you have to if you're a Titanic person. And actually, full circle moment, Gareth, I now am able to call him a friend. He's been on my podcast. We've stayed in touch. He's a wonderful human being. So I started reading all the new books and then I started looking for podcasts. And there were a lot of podcasts that had great like one-off episodes on Titanic, a lot of great history podcasts that had their Titanic series, but then there's no time in just a two-parter or three-parter to cover everything. So I found a lot of good podcast episodes, but I didn't find any real just Titanic podcasts. And I just decided to give it a go. My husband tells the story that I just one night over dinner, I said, well, there's no good Titanic podcast, so I guess I'll make one. And he tells the story, and he's so proud of me, and it's so sweet. But I guess, and I always sort of, kind of bristle when he tells the story. But I guess it really is that simple. Like it just kind of, that's always how I've been in my life. Like if I see a need or I see something I want to do, I just do it. And so I started with 2 or 3 episodes and thought I would just put them out as kind of an audio essay to the world during dark times. And I recorded from my son's closet because that's the only good sound quality I could get in our house full of young children. And here we are. It just started as a way to take some new research, use my skills as a historian and write some episodes and see what the world thought. And within a few months, it took off. And I think it did because there were just so many Titanic people at home because of the pandemic. And I think it really filled a need for a lot of people around the world that had this kind of long simmering passion about Titanic and wanted to talk about it, wanted to listen, wanted to take, deep dives into the topics. And so I think it was just kind of the right moment in time to do it, basically. But yeah, and now it's just become its own thing. I mean, it takes on a life of its own, and it's really fun.
We've talked about on my other podcast, Carganilla Online Variety Entertainment Pod. We did a co-cast actually.
We did, yeah.
And we talked about how following your heart, when you continue throughout your life to chase your passions, or follow your heart's fire, doors open. And this really opened. How did you starting Unsinkable change your life, or did it?
It did. In fact, I would say in my career as a historian, in my, the era of my adult life that I'm in kind of right now, it's probably the single most important thing that I've done. And, it's funny, like it was right before I started the podcast. I made this decision to finally get my Make It Count tattoo. I can never show it well on camera because it's, it just the angle's wrong. But, that really what it was about. Since I was a little girl and I watched that movie, I've always had this make it count notion in my head. And there've been times in my life where it's been hard to prioritize that, as we all do. But I'd sort of made this decision to finally, start living by that notion. And the podcast definitely folded into that for me. It's really been a way to kind of finally expose like all of my nerdy passions that I think a lot of times we're told to keep those at bay, or we're told they're guilty pleasures. I think for a lot of people, Titanic is categorized as a guilty pleasure interest. But I hate that term. I hate those words. It's this podcast has allowed me to sort of let my nerd flag fly. And in the process of showing that I am obsessed about Titanic, I am obsessed with the movie, I am obsessed with history. I sit around and I nerdily go down rabbit holes every day of my life. That's what I love. Once I was honest about that and started working in the realm of that honesty, yeah, just everything comes, I feel like everything comes, not that there's not work involved, but I feel like people and places and things, once your brain is open to that, to being true to yourself, you start to see it in other people. You start to recognize the other people that are like that. And the synchronicity sort of shows itself. And it really has with the podcast. I mean, I've traveled for the podcast more than I ever anticipated. I've been all over the world with it, all over the United States. We've done live shows. And it just, everywhere I go, I meet people that, if it weren't for Titanic, there would be a hole in their life. I've met so many people that Titanic fills this very important spot in their life, and it's very emotional. A lot of people I've met, they didn't have that. They would not feel, oh my goodness, cat, sorry. They would not feel fulfilled in their lives, and they want to talk about it and they want to feel included. So it's definitely been a very defining process in my life for sure.
I I've been so excited to have this conversation with you on this show because I really want to talk about the community, the Titanic community
Mhm.
online, the good and the bad. But before we get there, I'm just going to try and follow the timeline. Had you, when you started the podcast, done any editing, any producing before?
Never, never. I actually, you know what? I will, if we want some like real talk here, because one thing that I am such a proponent of, and you know this about me because even though we haven't met in person, we've been friends for a while now, and you know this about me. I am so about showing the process. Like for me, a really important thing as a creator, as a historian, whatever I'm doing, I want to be completely transparent about process. So for me, yeah, it was something I knew nothing about, and so I bought a bunch of books on how to podcast, and I read some books. My husband's a software engineer, so he's really great at helping me figure out like what I need to be doing, what software I should maybe give a try. So he gave me some ideas. But really and truly, I just downloaded Audacity and started working with it. I had never worked in any capacity with any sort of audio engineering, or hosting, no voice acting. I've never done anything in this realm. And so the first time that I sat down to record, was quite, I know this is real time. I'm gonna get my cat out of here because she's gonna drive us crazy. I'm gonna take my video off for just 1 second and deposit the cat upstairs. I'll be right back.
Good. Even though animals make any production better and more exciting. If you haven't yet heard, if you've been living in a Titanic hole or closet and haven't heard any of the episodes of Unsinkable, LA's podcast, she does an amazing job doing a deep dive into sometimes the minutia, or she'll focus on a certain passenger or a certain crew member whose story you've never heard before. And one thing I know she likes to ask guests when she's actually interviewing someone on her show is, why do you think Titanic is still such a huge part of people's lives? And we talked about in that co-cast how there's the unlimited treasure of stories to be told, and how you see yourself in each person, each crew member,
Mhm.
and that connection that so many people feel to a ship that didn't even finish its maiden voyage.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, like it never ceases to amaze me how little I still know about every person that was on board. I mean, unfortunately, we can't crack into the information about the crew as much as I would like, just because we don't have the information. But to go back to, finishing up the earlier question, and that's very kind of you. It's a wonderful description of the podcast. I sort of just, yeah, I sort of just taught myself how to do this because I wanted to get this stuff out into the world. And and that to me has been one of the most valuable parts of this experience too, is that I've not only we'll talk more about this, but meeting everybody that I've met, but I have learned so many new skills through doing this that it's opened up other opportunities for me as well. And so it's just more proof, like what we were talking about. You make it count, you make these decisions to just go for it. And it's an embarrassment of riches at that point. If you're open to receiving the good energy and the good vibes from making those decisions, I feel like often other things start to come to you as well. For sure. Yeah.
Having done deep dives on some of the minutia, do you have one or two favorite episodes or favorite topics that you didn't know about when you started and have you know grabbed a special place in your heart?
I think when I look back on all of the episodes that I've done, I think a couple that stand out, the story of the Mackay Bennett. Some people say Mackie Bennett. I've heard Mackay Bennett. My pronunciation could be wrong, but of course that was the ship that went to collect the Titanic's bodies. Um, I got really into reading about that. And it was sort of shocking to me how little I had known about that part of the story. And it's a very grim part of the story. Obviously, it's quite morbid, but I am probably the most proud of that episode because I did, as a historian, I often try to weave in bits of, literature, other things that I'm interested in. I really love food culture. I really love literature as well. Like I have other interests. I really love film culture. And in that episode, I was able to weave in this beautiful poetry that an author has done about the Undertaker, who was on board the ship. And I was able to weave in some poetry and some thoughts from other historians. And I think that episode is probably the best of me as far as, what I'm capable in telling the Titanic story and using my skills as a historian of looking at what other people have written, looking at what other people have done, and kind of creating my own narrative around those things. So that one was very eye-opening and very somber, but I think very beautiful to do. And then the other one on a slightly more upbeat tone that was so interesting that I never expected was the story of the beer that's on Titanic. And it's a lager called Wrexham Lager, which is also Wrexham has entered sort of the cultural consciousness for a lot of people because of Welcome to Wrexham, the football show with Ryan Reynolds. And so it really was this perfect blend of like mentioning some current pop culture stuff and getting to dig into the history of beer, which I had never done before. And so that was really fun. And so Titanic allows me as a historian to find all of these, let me move this so it's not as much glare, find all of these little pockets of kind of micro history that when you pull them out, not only do they relate to Titanic, but they're kind of awesome. I mean, the history of beer, like you can study that. I mean, like even when I was in grad school, I never thought, hey, maybe I can study the history of beer, but you absolutely can. You can study the history of anything you want to. And in the world that we live in now, there's people out there that have an appetite for anything that you may want to study. And so there's an audience for pretty much anything. And I think that's the cool part of the technology and the world we live in now.
I love one thing that I love about your show is how it's kind of like an encyclopedia in a way. How many seasons have you been going?
Well, we should have been on season 4 right now, but Hurricane Helene had its own plans. So I've had 3, solid seasons that are full seasons, and then technically we're in season 4 right now, but there were only a few that got out before the hurricane, and then now we're kind of rebranding a little bit. So, but I think there's something like I think it's 120 episodes, I want to say. So quite a bit. If someone hasn't found it yet and they're new to it, there's definitely quite a bit to dig into if you're new. So
What? Yeah. So what I was gonna say is like I discovered you, I think, toward the end of season 2. And so I've tried to go back and catch up, but also see, as you keep creating new content, listening to the new stuff that you're making. But it really is like an encyclopedia where if I have a question about something or I hear about something new, I search your podcast to see if you've done an episode
yeah.
about it. This happened in August. My family was blessed with the opportunity to take a trip to Ireland. And before we left, mutual friend Bill Willard asked me if I was going to Addergool. And I said, Addergool, what's Addergool? So I Googled it, learned a little bit about it, and then I thought, I wonder if LA's done an episode about this. And I searched, and there it is. And then it's like
Mhm.
everything I needed to know about it before we went. So if you are listening and you are a Titanic enthusiast and you have not yet explored or discovered Unsinkable, I encourage you to do that. Speaking of going to Ireland, oh man, I miss it. We did Belfast when my
Mhm.
family went. We did Belfast, Addergool, Cove, and I know like every day I wish I could go back and be there again in each of those spots. And
Mhm. Me
what has
too.
been your most what has been your most have been your most special memories in traveling with Titanic?
I mean, we would be here for 17 hours if I told them all, but for me, you mentioned Addergool. That's definitely one for me. when we were in Ireland, as I think you guys did, we rented a car. And we'd never been there before. We'd certainly never driven there before. And on the day that we were headed to Addergool, I think my husband John was like, "Where the hell are we?" Like, because it's not on any main thoroughfare. And, it's not even, I mean, it's a village, but there's not even really a pub. I mean, like after we went to the memorial, we were like, "Oh, I'm sure there's, maybe a little pub we can pop in and have a lunch." And there was a little place that was open, and it's like, "Oh no, we don't have a kitchen open." It's the kind of place where you really have to, kind of like everyone knows each other, I think, and there's not just like a convenience store on the corner. But that one was so special for me because I had no idea what to expect in terms of what it would look like. I had just heard there's a memorial here. I had obviously read the story of the Addergool 13. They were a group of Irish passengers that were from the same village. They were very young and they were headed to the United States. Many of them had siblings that had already gone on before, friends. And so they were kind of a close-knit network in this village. And one of them was a little bit older. She had been living in the United States for a while, and she came back and kind of gathered this group up to take and chaperone back. But I had no idea what to expect. And there's beautiful mountain. And in the shadows of these gorgeous mountains in Addergold, there's this beautiful statuary of the passengers and of the ship. It's this beautiful bronze statuary in the middle of this tiny little village that I think other than that, maybe it's just a cemetery and a couple of pubs that are open 2 days a week, So like I was saying, so it was really stunning and beautiful. There were like some cows that were being very vocal. So we were just walking around and interacting with cows and this, beautiful statuary and memorials. And they've done a really good job of interpreting this site. And it's a memorial to these people. And that day was really special. And I ended up building an episode around it. Cove is probably one of my favorite places I've ever been. We stayed at the Commodore Hotel, which is the hotel where the Lusitania victims were brought when that tragedy happened. And so there's so much maritime history in Cove. It's, if anyone who's interested in maritime history, even if Titanic is not your main thing and maritime history overall is your thing, you have to go to Cove. And you just walk, and we just walked. I mean, we were only there for 3 days. It felt like a week because time just slowed down. And you can walk through the Titanic experience, and you can go up to the balcony, and that's where the first and second class passengers stood before they boarded the tender to the ship. And those iconic photos of them waiting for the tender, you can stand right there. And I think in terms of our Ireland trip, those were probably the two most powerful ones, even though, I mean, Belfast is incredible. So, it's impossible to describe that feeling. I think you kind of have to have it for yourself. And I know you guys had it this summer, like when you get to these spots where Titanic was built, where her passengers were, if you are a Titanic person, it's just, and obviously travel is a privilege. And I know not everyone is able to do that, but if you are able to, save up and work towards it. I mean, that's what we did. It's so worth it as a Titanic person. Yeah, these photos are great. Yeah, we were right there. My favorite spot, it's right across from Titanic Experience. My favorite spot in Cove is the Mauritania pub. I don't know if you guys went there. But when we parked our car in Cove and we were walking the streets for the first time, and I turn around and I see Mauritania pub. And my first thought, and John can attest to this, I was just like a kid or a teenager. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, are there pubs all along here that are all named for the ships?" And I got so excited that every pub might be named for a ship, which is not the case. But and I have a friend that was just in Cove a few months ago, and they sent me a picture of the Mauritania pub, and I was like, "I hate you right now. I'm so mad I'm not there." But yeah, Cove, as the pictures that you just showed, that is beautiful and amazing. I'm trying to think. I have so many stories. I was in I was in Mackinac Island a couple of years ago doing a live show at the Grand Hotel there. They have a Titanic weekend some years. I think coming out of COVID, it hasn't been every year. I'm not sure. But it was wild. It's like people cosplaying as John Jacob Astor, as the Strausses in like these beautiful, very expensive full costumes. And at one point, I'm walking down the porch at the Grand Hotel in Mackinac Island, which has a amazing history all to itself. And I just see the Strausses walking towards me on the porch, and nobody else is in the scene, right? Like no one else is on the porch. It was like the pre-dinner hour. A lot of people were in their rooms getting ready for the night. And the Strausses are just walking towards me on this porch that was built in 1880. Like, how do I get to live these experiences? And this is a lot of what my book is about, is like, how have I ended up in these crazy Titanic experiences that, I mean, most Titaniacs would like die to be in. And I'm so lucky to have gotten these. And one, I know we probably need to move on to another question, but one more that just popped into my head and got me very emotional. This past summer, we were in Scotland, and it was not a Titanic trip. And my family, I think, was due a non-Titanic trip. We've had a lot of Titanic trips the last few years, but and Scotland doesn't have a ton of Titanic connections, unfortunately. But we were just like walking on the like estate of this castle. It's actually the castle that Monty Python was filmed at. It's very well known for that. And we were just kind of having one of our walkabout days, and we were down like by this river, really beautiful. And this man is walking towards me on the other path, and he's wearing a Titanic hat. And I'm like, of course, right? Like everywhere I go. And so I'm like pointing because I think my son had his sweatshirt on, and I can't remember. I think I might have had my hat or one of my sweatshirts on. And so I'm like, hey, hey, and he sees it, but he didn't speak English. And so we did not have a shared language. And so we couldn't actually say anything to each other except Titanic, but it was like Titanic, Titanic. And so that's all we could communicate to each other. But it was really cool because in that moment, in the middle of, rural Scotland, like two people, well, us as a whole family and this person were basically communicating to one another. We freaking love Titanic. And we can't, we don't have the same language, but in a way we have the same language, if that makes sense. And so that one, I've had a lot of little fun moments like that just remind me, how important all of this is. So
In a way, Titanic is the language of love. But so you are just a prime example of following your heart's fire and doors opening for you. But there's also a combination. It's a lot like show business. You have to have a combination of that and talent and skill. And you're obviously a brilliant writer and storyteller. And so I think those stars aligned for sure. Rebecca in the live chat says, you make it so great, great storytelling voice. And the way you arrange each episode is great. We never get tired of it. And a huge reason you're able to go to a different part of the world and just say Titanic with another Titanic lover is there are so many people out there whose the Titanic, as you mentioned earlier, fills a big part of their daily life and holds a special place in their heart. And that's kind of what I wanted to examine with this podcast is it's not going anywhere. It's flourishing,
mm-hmm.
and the stories are growing, and the community seems to be growing. I know for a lot of time, for a while, there was shame after it went down, so people just didn't talk about it. But now
Mm-hmm.
it seems like people are able to in a more safe space. But
Mm-hmm.
before we go, I know we're already at a half hour. That's wild. But I want to talk to you about this community because it is there's a bright side to it, and it also seems to be a lot of infighting. We'll start with the good news. What has been your
um,
most special discovery about the community?
so I think, I sort of already alluded to it, and I'll go into detail now. I think the most important and beautiful thing about being a Titanic person is that if you put five people, I really believe if you put five people in a room that have never met one another, and maybe they're from all over the country or even all over the world, if you put them in a room and they all love Titanic, you would 30 minutes later they'd be planning a vacation together. It's just bonding thing no matter what walk of life you're from or what type of life you live. If you're a Titanic person, there's this common language. And I think it's one of the few things in the world that's really done that for people. And so it's so, so special. And for me, I couldn't, if I tried to count them, I couldn't, the number of times that I have been at a conference or a live show or just received an email where someone has said, actually, I'll give an example. And I obviously won't mention a name or anything, but I got an email, I guess it was probably about a year and a half ago, from a woman who said, I recently had a baby. I've been in kind of postpartum, a little bit of postpartum depression, baby blues kind of zone, which, for women is very common. I went through that. A lot of women go through that. As a society, we're doing a better job of talking about that, but we still have a long way to go. But she said, so I really wasn't doing well mentally. And I found your podcast and I just go on these long walks and I listen to your podcast and it's really, I'm going to start crying. And it's really helped me like feel better, feel more like myself. And I remember when I got that email, I'm sorry, I cry over everything. I went to John, my husband, and I read him the email. And then I said, even if nothing, not another thing comes from this podcast, even if I never hear from one more person, even if not one more person ever downloads this, it's all been worth it because of this one email. You know what I mean? Because I have been that person. Like I was the mom with two tiny babies, frazzled and not great mental health, and have found podcasts or movies or TV shows or whatever it may be to like help keep me grounded and make me feel sane. And so the fact that what I had produced had helped at least one person just feel more human, more like themselves, feel connected to something, all worth it. Just even if that's the only email I had ever received, it would have been worth it. And so I think the Titanic community allows people to be themselves. It allows them to let their nerd flag fly in the best way. And I think there's a lot of people out there there's a lot of people out there in the world who are lonely and have a lot of struggle and a lot of stuff going on in their lives, and Titanic is a ray of hope for them. And it's a community that has welcomed in the lonely and maybe people that don't have as many friends, maybe people who are struggling with mental health, whatever it may be, struggling with identity. Titanic is one of those communities that has become a safe space for people. So we have to protect that like 100%, because I think historically it really has been that, and we have to work hard to keep it that way. Absolutely.
On the flip side, you talk about protecting this special thing. Since starting this show, have experienced some very territorial other Titanic people who feel like this is their space and what am I doing here? And this is something we actually talked about before I launched this, was just like, what's going on in the Titanic social media community, and is there space for a show like this? Is there ever a need for more? But since joining this space, I have bumped into a couple of people who I did not have very positive experiences with, or just kind of discouraged me right off the bat. And do you think have you experienced that? And do you think that's part of protecting the space?
I have experienced it, unfortunately. As a woman in this space, I have unfortunately experienced. I think I can be totally honest here, right? Like, I mean, that's always what I do. I'll just go ahead and go on a limb and tell this story. But I think that as a woman in this space too, not just as like new person in the Titanic space, but as a woman, I feel like people are very emboldened to ask things of me or say things to me that they would not say to a man, or to, people that are more established in the community, some of the older historians and such. I have received emails from people saying like, who do you think you are? Titanic is not about race or gender. You're making Titanic too woke. You're full of yourself. I mean, you'll just look at my Apple to iTunes reviews and you'll see some of the trolling, like it's there.
Mm.
I think I just make people uncomfortable that are people that are more in the sort of traditional, like, Walter Lord, Night to Remember. Here is our very white, very like kind of bleached and sanitized Titanic history. I think I make those people uncomfortable, but that's what I set out to do. So I just view that as a success. And this is what I've been doing. I started in academia when had just turned 21 years old. I started grad school when I was barely 21. I went into this academic setting with people way older and way more experienced than me and had no idea what I was doing. So this is just kind of always what I've done. And so I'm very used to getting the flack from being the person that does that. So it doesn't bother me anymore. But yeah, people are very territorial over Titanic. I think you're exactly right. You hit the nail on the head. Unfortunately, there's a lot of gatekeeping. A lot of people in the community think the history of Titanic has already been written, right? We have Walter Lord, we have Bob Ballard, we have James Cameron, we have all of the quintessential timeline of Titanic. And so here's the story, here are the passengers that matter, and we're done. I think a lot of people just want it kind of put in amber and left alone. And so I think people like me, people like you that want to go above and beyond that, I think it just sort of scares them. I think it comes out of fear. And unfortunately, fear often turns into aggression in those situations. And I'm sorry you've had to deal with that. I think unfortunately it just kind of comes with the territory. But yeah, I think territorial is the key thing. A lot of people are territorial. The other thing that's going on to me that's very bothersome is this sense that Titanic is the kind of buzzword content. I think for me, if there's an unsettling trend in the online Titanic community, is just the use of it as kind of fodder for, whether it's, I mean, I don't do TikTok, but whether it's, reels on Instagram or whether it's just a way to gain followers, it's disturbing to me to see it used as the sort of like 10 to 20 second attention getter. I'm not a fan of anything going that direction, but especially not Titanic. So unfortunately, I think some people view it as a moneymaker. Like, oh, if I mention Titanic, I get this number of likes or this number of followers. And there's always an audience for it. So I get why they're doing that on some level, but to me, that's probably the most disturbing thing is that I want people to I want the Titanic content out there to be accurate and researched and thought-provoking. I see so many reels on Instagram, for example, now that are just throw Celine Dion on with a couple of clips from a Titanic exhibition and someone in like a leather miniskirt, and it's like, I'm a Titanic influencer now, right? It sort of has that air to it, and maybe I'm just getting older, but that just doesn't appeal to me at all. So
Get off my Titanic lawn, we say.
Yeah.
No, but you have been such an amazing creator, such an asset to Titanic's story moving forward, a friend and mentor of mine, and I appreciate you so much. What is next for you and the podcast and your projects?
A lot. I am in the process of writing right now. I hope to have, and if you're a Patreon member, I'll, into the year a little bit, hopefully I'll be sharing a few kind of sneak peeks. Hope to have more information as the year progresses on when the book will be out. But I'm just writing, it's the worst and the best mode to be in because writing is so much fun for me and allows me to express myself in the key central way that I want to. But it's also really difficult. Anybody who's ever been a writer on any level, writing is very hard and it takes a lot of concentration and there are a lot of bumps in the road. So yeah, writing mode. And then in terms of the podcast, I am rebranding a little bit. The hurricane, hitting was awful. Anybody that doesn't know, I live in the Asheville area. So we got hit by Hurricane Helene and the entire community has just really been changed. It's been very traumatic. It really, just like in 2020, when I started the podcast initially, this gave me a kick in the pants of like, do not get in a rut. Do not get lazy with this. And I have over the past year gotten really into some other loves of mine from the historical realm, kind of refallen in love with the history of slavery, African American history, labor history, environmental history. I've been reading a lot back into some of the stuff that I wrote about and taught in grad school. And so I'm rebranding to Unsinkable, the Deep Past. It's not going to be the Titanic podcast anymore. We are still going to talk about Titanic, and Patreon is going to stay very Titanic focused. But I want to tell the stories of people who've spoken really loudly and have tried really hard to make a difference and to work against inequality. And I feel it in my soul that I have to do that. There's a lot of stories that I want to tell. And I think we live in a world that more than ever, those stories need to be shouted from the rooftops. There are so many small, beautiful stories of men, women, families who have done so much to make the country, the world, like what it is, and we don't know their names. And I think it's really important. Just like with the Titanic passenger, it's so important to illuminate their stories, find out what kind of world they came from and who they were. There's just a lot of people out there that deserve that. So I am broadening out, but I'll continue to be in the Titanic community. I've got a lot of exciting stuff coming down the pipeline. Some of my best friends are in the Titanic community now, and obviously working on the book. And so I'm not going anywhere in terms of Titanic, but once again, my make it count intuition clicked in, and that's where we're going. So it's going to be a hopefully not too bumpy, transition and ride, but there's a lot of exciting stuff coming. But immediately, the next Titanic related episode that will be out within just a few days, I did a deep dive into all the public relations and marketing involving Titanic and the White Star Line. And I recorded that with my good friend Pablo Ohana, who is basically my honorary co-host on Unsinkable at this point. But he is a PR and marketing professional. I mean, this is what he does. And so he gave his insight into the history of White Star Line and its PR and marketing and all that. It's a really fun episode. So that's going to be out in a few days. I think that's about it. But yeah, I'm just, anybody that wants to come and follow on the journey, I'm very grateful and excited. And I just have a lot I want to share. So I'm stoked.
If you haven't yet discovered it, find it. Unsinkable Podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts, on Instagram, on Patreon. She's there. I am so grateful for this friendship that has developed over a love of Titanic. As Clifford Ismay has been on my show a couple of times now, and he likes to say that, Titanic was a ship that was designed and built to bring people together. She didn't get to do that, but she's still doing it today. And I think you're a prime example of that, bringing people together. The community you've built is fantastic, and we are grateful for you and your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Grateful for you. The work you do to bring the community together is, I would argue that you're on the forefront of that. I think it takes really smart and really impassioned people to be at the forefront of something like that, and you are. So we're also appreciative of what you do, 100%.
Oh, so sweet. Thank you. Hey, everybody, give it up one more time for LA Beadles.
Thank you, guys.
You are the best, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Until next episode, remember, as we've been talking about all episodes, seize the day, follow your heart's fire, and make it count. Bye, everyone.